I was working in a bar when they found me. The bar had seen better days and so had the customers. The greasy, shabbily dressed men with zero personal hygiene who sat at the corner drinking beer and complaining. There was nothing too petty for them to moan about, and I had long ago tuned them out. I stood there, blank-faced, wiping down the bar and pulling yet another drink all day long and into the night. I'd been working at the bar for a couple of years, and I had no plans to move on. Heck, I had no plans of any kind. As far as I was concerned, I had reached the end of the road. I used to be a soldier who had been dishonorably discharged when a mission that I was on went badly wrong, and lives were lost. The blame was pinned on me, which was absolute garbage. It was not my fault. I was brooding over this, as I did every day, when the soldiers walked in. I could tell they were soldiers even though they weren't wearing any uniforms. It was their confidence, their lean but muscular frames, that and their matching haircuts. There were three of them. The oldest, his buzz-cut grain, stepped forward and said, "You got somewhere private that we can talk?" I eyed him suspiciously as I replied, "The kitchen's quiet. The customers are all on liquid diets. Will that do?" He nodded and I led the way. The kitchen was a small dank room with several interesting species of mold sprouting from the work surfaces. The soldiers stood around me. It felt like I was being hemmed in, and I didn't like that one little bit. The one who had taken the lead before, the officer I figured, looked me in the eye and said, "We've got a mission for you." I laughed. I couldn't help myself. "Earth to Uncle Sam," I said. "It's been a long time since I was in the army. And just in case you didn't know, I didn't leave on good terms." His eyes narrowed. "I know everything about you. I know you were a career soldier, a sergeant. One of the best in extracting nationals held in hostile territory, and highly decorated for it. I know that you were on a covert operation that went belly up, because of mistakes that you made." Anger flared inside me. "That's bull," I snapped. He lifted his hands, palms out. "Calm it," he said. "I also know that that was the official line only. The real mistakes were made by people higher up the food chain. And though I can't get the record changed to show that, I can get your dishonorable discharge removed." I was still furious. 5 years after my unit had been cut down by enemy fire after our location was exposed by an unsecure communication line, my nerves were still raw, not only about the injustice done to me, but also because good men had died. I stared down at the floor, thought hard and fast, and made a decision. I looked back up. "Talk," I said. He explained the mission. It was crazy, incredibly dangerous, with a minimal chance of success. When he had finished, I said, "I do this and you guarantee that my name is cleared?" "Yes," he answered. "You have my word." I did not trust him, but I had to. The army had been my life, and this was my chance at redemption. 6 hours later, I was on a helicopter heading for northern Alaska. I had heard the name of the town that I was being sent to and a lot of wild stories about the place, even though what had happened there was absolutely classified. The army is good at keeping secrets from outsiders, but it is also packed to the gills with soldiers who like to share stories with their comrades over a drink. And I had been stationed with men who had been on the ground when Incident Zero had taken place. Incident Zero had happened almost a decade ago. An army transporter had been conveying a top-secret load from an isolated research facility to a base south of the border. The town was the only populated area for thousands of miles around, and these soldiers in the transporter were meant to give it a wide berth. But they wanted a coffee, maybe a burger to go with it. So they had detoured and were trundling along the main street of the town when a drunk driver had collided with them. The drunk was traveling at speed and died instantly. The transporter was sent skidding off the road and into the diner that these soldiers had been planning on visiting. The load was compromised and a gas was released. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Because of the remote location, it took more than 18 hours for troops to reach the area to try and contain the situation. One of the men who had been there described the scene to me as hell on earth. As I wondered how much had changed since then, adrenaline pumped through my body. I hadn't felt like this since my last mission, and to be honest, I was buzzing, no matter how low the odds of success were. I took one more look at the manila folder that I had been handed by the soldier with the graying buzz cut. There was a photo of a young woman in it. She was pretty, with a mischievous glint in her blue eyes. Her long blonde hair was in a ponytail. Her age was noted as 24, and she was the only daughter of a 5-star general. The file detailed her academic achievements and her criminal record. All minor offenses, but not the sort of thing the apple of daddy's eye should be getting up to at the weekend. It seemed the general's daughter had decided to rebel against authority, and now she had taken things a step further. After going through the papers he kept at home and discovering the ugly truth, she had traveled to the location of Incident Zero to film the area and expose what had really happened to the world's media. The facts with the army and politicians had conspired to carefully cover up. She had taunted her father about this a few days before, and then her signal was lost, which is why they needed me. I was to go in light and fast, find her and get her out alive, and destroy any footage that she had before she was delivered back to her father, presumably for something more serious than a grounding. I closed the folder, and we passed over the towering concrete wall that had been constructed by the army in the weeks following Incident Zero, to turn the town into a no-go zone, or so I thought. That wall wasn't much use in keeping the general's daughter out. I said into my radio. The reply crackled on my headset. It's not there for keeping things out. I took a deep breath, checked my firearm one more time. The town was just ahead. Hell had not gotten any more attractive over the last 10 years. Abandoned cars littered the streets, buildings were abandoned. Seconds later, the helicopter was skirting the ground and I was being given the signal to disembark. I jumped out and watched the helicopter rising back into the air. I was on my own. I scanned the immediate area through 160 degrees, saw broken windows, a shopping bag on the sidewalk 6 feet away from me, its contents spilled out, a truck. The driver's side door was open, and there were a pair of boots in the footwell. They looked old but in good condition, not the type of boots that you would just abandon. I walked over to the truck and peered in. There were foot bones in the boots, 2 complete sets, and dark stains on the dash that could have been mistaken for rust if you didn't know any better. I moved away from the dried blood that spread further throughout the interior of the truck and I moved on. To my left, the open door of a bar was banging against its frame in the wind. A sign painted on a still-broken pane of glass in its window advertised, half-price drinks all day Sunday. There was more dried blood smeared across the inside of the window. The wind that was keeping the bar door in motion was biting cold. Despite this, I was sweating. My shirt was sticking to my back and my palms were slick where they held the gun. I told myself that this was all fine. I was a professional doing what they did best, extracting people from bad situations. I started to move down the street. The traffic signals were dark. I passed the wrecks of more cars. Most would have been 4-wheel drives, the type of practical, sturdy vehicles needed to live out here. Some of them had crashed into each other before their owners had passed into history. There were still keys in the ignitions, flasks on the passenger seats, a child's backpack in the seat of one. I swallowed back down sick which had risen into my mouth. I was starting to get the shakes. I had heard the stories from these soldiers who had been here, but seeing it up close was a different ballgame. I kept moving, kept checking my left, my right, alert and ready. The only sounds were that dang door banging and my own breathing. My heartbeat was beating too fast and I could feel it, like an alarm that you couldn't turn off. In her last message before the signal went, The general's daughter had told her old man that she was heading for the diner where the transporter had crashed. There had been a map of the town in the manila folder as well. I studied it and had the route to the diner clear in my mind. I needed to turn left at the end of the main street. Walking more quickly, fighting back the urge to run, I got to it. I had just reached the turn when I saw my first survivor from Incident Zero. The only survivor is the wrong word. I thought it was a pile of rags at first. Everything else was lying around abandoned in the street, so why not clothing as well? I thought. But then the rags began to move, and I saw the bones inside and the flesh still hanging out in places. This thing that was crawling towards me had been a person at one time, a resident of this town. Its eyes were gone, long since rotted away, I had figured. A patch of scalp still covered the top of its skull with a few tufts of black hair sticking up. Its right forearm had skin. A faded tattoo of an eagle was clearly visible. There were tendons, these scraps of organs. Other than that, it was a skeleton that was closing in on me. A problem that I had not been anticipating presented itself to me. I knew how the soldiers who had been sent here in the aftermath of Incident Zero had killed the afflicted. After a degree of trial and error, shoot first and learn afterwards, they had discovered the way to put the things down for good. It was to shoot them in the head, destroy the brain, and the monster. And I leaned over to try and see better through the empty eye sockets. This thing did not seem to have a brain. Another few seconds and it would be at my feet. I swore and opened fire. Bullets tore through bone, separating skeletal limb from the remains of muscle, until the thing lay in pieces. It twitched, jerked, seemed to be trying to fight on and reach me, but it was pretty much just human leftovers now. I did not know how many more there were still in the town. Almost the entire population had been turned into chaos following the crash and the release of the gas. The drunk driver was the first. To the horror of these soldiers who had been in the transporter, the driver's body dragged itself from the car and started walking towards them. The driver's head had been close to decapitated in the crash and it hung down to one side. Somehow, this had not stopped it from biting the first soldier and tearing a chunk out of his neck. This unfortunate soul turned minutes later and attacked his comrades. By nightfall, the newly dead owned the town. I know this because of the almost. One teenage boy managed to hide in the space under the porch of the local chapel and saw hell being born. He was rescued by the soldiers and taken to a secure hospital where he will probably see out the rest of his life. The transcript of the interviews with him had also been in the manila folder. Poor kid. And poor me, if I did not get a move on. I ran this time, left, away from the main street. The crashed transporter came into view. Its rear end had slammed into the window of the diner, and the cab at the front was twisted, almost on its side. There was no sign of the general's daughter. I decided to check out the diner first, and I clambered over the back of the transporter to get inside. Trashed plastic tables and chairs were scattered across the floor. Apart from the furniture of one corner booth, it was intact. A dead man sat there staring at me. It had a baseball cap on and big black framed spectacles. Behind them, the remains of eyeballs peered out. The rest of it was better preserved than the last thing I had encountered as well. There were gaping wounds in its face and the skin of its hands were hideously decayed. Apart from that, it looked in pretty good shape considering all things. It certainly got to its feet quick enough and started to shuffle towards me. Its arms were held out in front and it was moaning. Drool dripped from the corners of its mouth, and I swear the freak was licking what was left of its lips. I am not for dinner, I told it, and I blew a hole in its forehead. I stood there for a moment. I wondered if what the soldiers had said about totaling the brain was true. and then it fell onto its knees and face planted the linoleum floor. My shoulders dropped. I felt a moment of relief. And then these swing doors to the kitchen opened and a whole host of them appeared. The soldiers had taken out a lot of the reanimated corpses of the townsfolk by the time the order had came to fall back and to build the perimeter wall. But not enough. From my point at that moment in time, nowhere near enough. The thing in the vanguard of the group had once been a woman. Her hair had continued growing and reached now beyond her waist. The skin on her face hung off under her eyes, like she was weeping tears made of pale flesh. Her teeth were bare, as were those of the things crowding behind her. Men, women, and a dog. A great hulking thing whose fangs were exposed to the gums where its snout had decayed away. It looked like it was back on the menu. I felt bad about taking the dog out. The rest were a matter of self-survival. My ears ringing from the gunfire, I stepped over them and across the diner floor, and I went into the kitchen. It appeared to be deserted. My instincts were screaming at me that this was not the case. Something had drawn the things here, and I did not see any way out of the kitchen. I reloaded my firearm and raised it as I pried open the door of the freezer propped against one wall. With no escape, this was the obvious hiding place. And sure enough, there she was. Pale, shivering like crazy, even though the freezer hadn't been connected for a long time, and closing in on asphyxiation. I lowered the gun, took her arm and helped the general's daughter stumble out. She held a mobile phone in her right hand. As gentle as I could, I pried her fingers off of it and then took out the SIM card, snapped it in for good measure, crushed the phone under my boot. She swore at me. "I'm glad you're feeling better," I said. The color was coming back into her cheeks and there was fire in her blue eyes when she spoke. "What they did here was wrong. The world needs to know." "The world is not my problem," I replied, even though I agreed with her, even though I was suddenly furious. After all these years, something had snapped inside of me. The army had chewed me up and spat me out, and I had jumped right back into its big, ugly jaws, doing their dirty work because of my pride. "Come on," I said. "Let's get out of here." I was not going to hand her over to the army and her father. I was going to help her escape. She smiled at me, understanding. She was still groggy, but with my help, we were soon managing a jog. She had brought climbing gear and ropes and was leading us back to where her kit was still in place. Once we made it over the wall, we had thousands of miles of wilderness to survive before we made it to safety. And along the way, the army would soon be hunting for us when I did not report in. I was ready for these challenges. The perimeter wall was in sight when she finally collapsed. I caught her before she hit the ground, lowered her the final inches with her head, a cradle in my hands. All the color had flooded out of her and her face was soaked in sweat. "What is it?" I asked. She groaned and arched her back, and I saw the bite wound in her side, just above her waist, and it was ugly, red, and stank. She looked up at me. "I'm sorry," she said. "One of them got me before I could get into the freezer." "It'll be okay," I said, and I moved away a strand of her hair which had fallen over her eyes. I was lying. It was not going to be okay. She was dying, and after that, things would get worse, and she knew it. Her eyelids began to flicker. She was starting to drift away. Her lips moved and she said something, but too quiet for me to hear. I leaned closer and heard her when she said again, "Do it." I raised the gun and fired. Afterwards, I carried her body over the perimeter wall. I didn't want her to remain imprisoned within. I carried her for hours through the wilderness until I came across a clearing. It was beautiful and peaceful. I buried her there, said goodbye as the sun was streaming through the branches, and it bathed her final resting place in light.